John is the Director of Technical Services here at BTB Security. Has extensive experience not only on the OS side, but a lot on the application side and network side as well in terms of security. A lot of different perspectives here. John leads up the team that does a lot of these penetration tests and a lot of the assessment services, or really all the assessment services and penetration tests for BTB Security. He's also the co-lead for OWASP in the Philadelphia area. So I'm going to turn it over to John. He has a good presentation here. I'm sure you guys will like his style. And then towards the end, we'll do some Q&A with the chat window, which John can see, and we can answer those questions as we go forward. So, John, turning it over to you, and everybody enjoy.
Sounds good. Thanks, Ron, for the introduction. Can you guys hear me okay? Ron, you can probably let me know if the sound is good.
Sounds good from my perspective, and we got some verification from a couple different participants that everyone can hear you. So unless we get something in the chat window saying that it's bad, we'll just continue on. And we got another verification, so I think we're good to go.
Sounds good. Awesome. So just a little bit about me. I would like to think of myself as a hacker. Obviously, there's hacker has a little bit of negative connotation probably in the public. So white hat, ethical, any type of non-malicious term or nice adjective hacker. So I like to twinkle with things. Obviously, my official title, as Ron had mentioned, I'm the Director of Technical Services at BTB, also the co-chair for OWASP for Philadelphia. I've been referred to as Ninja, Diva, Foodie by coworkers and clients alike. I've been a pen tester since 2007. The range of pen tests that I've been involved with ranges from big companies to a very small shop. And before being a pen tester, I used to do a little bit of research on operating system network security. Also used to be a much more avid programmer, especially in C, C++. Dabbled in Ruby a little bit, PHP, play with Perl to automate things. So that's about me, and enough about me. And this talk is really about authentication access problem. Obviously, multi-factor authentication is often viewed as the promised savior for problems of relying only on the passwords. So how does multi-factor authentication help? And I think a lot of people have a very positive view on multi-factor authentication, and BTB is definitely one of them. And I myself personally am a big advocate. But what I see there is a lot of myths and how what's not very well publicized is that how it might not help, and some of the gaps and fails that we've seen along the lines of multi-factor authentication and what I call common misconceptions. So we'll kind of go through them. We'll also go through kind of reiterate some of the authentication problems for those who probably are sick and tired of hearing about it. But I'll just reiterate it just to pose that problem again, just to remind everybody. So let's begin with that. So we call the password problem bad pass. I'm sure you guys have probably seen the infamous publication of Badlock. Obviously, it had turned into Sadlock, but we joked internally within BTB is that forget about Badlock, Sadlock, Heartbleed. Really, the biggest problem that we see in a lot of organizations is the problem bad pass. Obviously, we try to come up with a formal description of it, where the vulnerability impacts most, if not all organizations, may lead to bad passwords used by at least 10% of the users with above 90% probability. Obviously, we're having a lot of fun with the formal description of a common problem, where a lot of people understand it, but might be in denial that it doesn't impact them, or they might know it and still hiding under the cover that it's not going to lead into something really bad. Obviously, the root cause is that, let's be honest, people are lazy, right? And the risk, if exploited, it can lead to unauthorized access and a lot of bad things, and it can lead to breach. So things that we see here, this is a password guessing attack using a tool called Medusa, and we're targeting against a domain controller where we're trying to see if there is any type of passwords that use likes of welcome1, welcome2, welcome3, or welcome up to, I think, 2 or 3 digits. And here in this particular environment, and this is an actual data that we got from a few years ago, is that the result was that we found passwords that had the like of welcome1, welcome, the word welcome with a capital W in it. There was 831 user accounts that had it, and that was actually valid. So obviously, grep B is the inverse grep, looking for everything but accounts disabled accounts, and yeah, this is bad. And obviously, some of the other choices, in the Hall of Fame is password 1, any type of season plus year, and company 2016. So for example, btbsecurity or btb 2016 or something like that. So most people realize that these type of passwords exist. I mean, if you're really honest about your employees and your environment, very likely that at least a few accounts like this will exist. In this case, a lot of accounts exist. So what happens with that is that hackers will definitely find them. So here we did a password guessing attack against employees' names and user accounts that we found from LinkedIn and data.com, Facebook, and ran the passwords and found there were 6 users with password 1. Then obviously when the password gets compromised, typically this happens where you get access to the VPN, a remote access into the environment. Sooner or later, the attacker gets access to the domain controller, LDAP authentication or some type of centralized authentication where admin access to everything is possible. You extract the user hashes or passwords. And then soon this happens where the data that you're trying to protect or the business resources that you're trying to protect gets exposed because the attacker gets in through bad passwords, gets into the environment using that, escalates access sooner or later if they're good enough, and will get access to some of the information or business resources. So why doesn't everybody use good password, right? I mean, personally, this is a screenshot of KeyPass. I usually start with 20. If it's anything that's kind of access related, where I'm VPNing in, I'll up that to 40 or 50, and then generate the password and use it. Why don't we do this? Because good passwords are hard to remember. Obviously, this isn't something that I can remember, so obviously I use password management tool. But there are going to be outliers in your environment saying that, well, that's too hard to use. We don't have time for that. Are you telling me that you have to force me to use yet another tool on top of all the things that I have to do, like Microsoft Word and things like that? So there are going to be some people who are just not going to be part of the system. Or there are a lot of people who use password management tool, but the passwords that are stored on the password management tools are exactly the same as the ones that they remember, which often is the time when we get into an environment. A lot of people have password lists that they manage on Word doc or text file or Excel sheet, and we see that 50% of them are exactly the same password. Oftentimes it's variation of welcome1 and password 1. So that's problem number 2. Good passwords are hard to remember and manage. Password number 3. This is something that we all know. This is kind of rings true with the LinkedIn 2012 hack results coming out. Why should everybody worry that, well, it's back in 2012, why should I worry? Because everybody uses the same password for everything. This is an XKCD comic that was, it's actually an excerpt of one. If you guys want a full comic strip, you can go to the link there. But, really, a lot of times people come up with a password and then they use it everywhere, which is often the case. So with all these data breaches occurring all over the place, and this is a snapshot that I took maybe about a month ago when I was thinking about the webinar, but 505 data breaches with password leaks. I went to privacyrights.org, data breach. I searched for password-related breaches where the breaches involved disclosure of passwords. There are 505 of them, and if one of the sites where people are reusing the password is broken, maybe your environment is also at risk if that user is also reusing the same password for VPN or emails and things like that. And these are, of course, if you read the Verizon the breach report, these are only the ones that we know about. Obviously, there are a lot of breaches that we don't know about. So that's what's really scary here. And of course, if you guys are paying attention to a lot of the recent attack vectors, a lot of that involve phishing. So the problem with phishing and password is that passwords are inherently vulnerable to phishing. So people can ask you to log into a particular site. In some phishings that we've seen in real environments, so we have managed services that monitor our clients, some of the phishing attempts really just ask you to return to them a Word doc filled with their information, including using their password. And some people do fall for it, which is what's crazy. And obviously, an attacker may be able to get into the target environment. And also, password could be vulnerable to man-in-the-middle attack, where attacker convinces the victim to log into their site. They reuse the actual credentials and they log in. The victim doesn't necessarily go to the actual web server. They're just routing through the attacker. So when the phishing creds, when the phish creds are obtained by the attacker gets into their remote access, and same kind of thing that we've seen with the leak password, where they get access to everything eventually. So we've all heard this before, and obviously a lot of the sales reps out there will advocate multi-factor authentication is the key to this problem that we have. So instead of just having one factor, which is typically something where the password fall into, you also have to prove who you are by something you have or something you are. And let me just clarify what that means. So a lot of people confuse security questions in addition to passwords as two-factor, but it's actually, I would like to think of it as more of a two-step, because security questions is really more addition to what you know. But with the prevalence of social media, what you know for security questions is what you know and advertise. Often, you share with a lot of people through social media. So some of the popular security questions that I've seen was, what was the first car you owned? And I did a quick Facebook search for first car, and I saw that first time driving and parking my car, woohoo! And obviously this is something that can be easily found through Facebook, LinkedIn, what have you. Maybe it's the first job. You can kind of see somebody's job trail, something that could easily guess. So social media wins on this contest. What about fingerprint scanners that we have on the phone? I don't consider it as a two-factor because eventually, after you do use your fingerprint to authenticate, from the surface of it, it seems like you need your fingerprint to get in, or at least it's biometric, isn't it? But a lot of times what happens with fingerprint scanner is that fingerprint scanner is used to encrypt the password on the phone, and eventually what gets sent to the authentication service, like Google or maybe even your VPN or your email, is the password that is stored on the phone, which is encrypted with your fingerprint. So eventually it turns into a password for most cases. So it's not necessarily a two-factor. And of course, Breaking that encryption is hard. Guessing that password, which could be password 1 or welcome 1, is very easy. So I want to talk and focus about something you have, which is the factor that's used most as a second factor. You've probably seen the RSA Secure ID token, the hard token that's shown on the top left corner. That's probably the most old school, or maybe the most old school would be the bottom right, where you have the smart card, where a lot of the government employees would have. I don't know if anybody recognizes the top right, the E token, but that's the USB key that contains the private key for client-side SSL, TLS authentication. So my old school, with the school where I went to, used that for the second factor. A lot of people will recognize the one in the middle where it's gaining popularity. That's the duo out-of-band two-factor authentication, where when you log in, you type push, or it's automatically configured to send a request in to say, hey, you request an authentication service. If you approve, so somebody has to click approve for that. Some of the variation, obviously, on the bottom left, that's an SMS-based authentication where you have to enter in the PIN that got texted to you. And obviously, there's a soft token alternative to the hard token. So what two-factor authentication actually gives you is the protection against problem 1, which was weak password, the bad pass. Obviously, you don't have to people picking bad password is something that it can be prevented, because the two-factor will have a strong password or random number that ticks and things like that. And obviously, you don't have to remember. You carry it with you, either on your phone. It's not something that you have to keep track of, other than the device or token or USB key that you're carrying with you. You can't really share it because the administrators kind of force it so that it's all different. So that's great. But what about phishing and man-in-the-middle? And what about something for web-based authentication? Obviously, I'm the chair for OWASP, so I have to kind of touch on more on the web-based stuff. What about session hijack? Is that possible for two-factor authentication? Does it solve some of the issues related to phishing, where a lot of the threat vectors are coming from nowadays, that it leverages phishing attack? So let's talk about man-in-the-middle, or the man-in-the-middle and the phishing consideration. So TLS, which is SSL for the better, and TLS mutual authentication, using for example, client-side certificate and the private key that's associated with the certificate. You can actually have a server-side authentication passed by buying a very cheap certificate. This is what we do at BTB for pen testing. We register a domain and we buy a really cheap certificate to go along with it, so that the users don't necessarily see a browser warning for saying, hey, certificate invalid. A lot of times for the phishing side, you control the actual site that the user is going to. So you control the domain. You don't necessarily have to use the domain that the user is using. For example, they don't have to use vpn.btbsecurity.com. They might be able to use vpn.btb2bsecurity.com or something like that. Be a little bit of a pretender or spoof site or something like that. But on the client-side authentication, the man-in-the-middle can't necessarily use the client certificate to or use the certificate to authenticate. It can't use their own because the authentication will fail because the certificate's information doesn't match, and obviously they can't track it down to the root of trust. And if they have to relay the client certificate, they can't necessarily decrypt the session key the way that the TLS authentication works. So that's really great that the TLS mutual authentication, especially using something like a USB token that contains private key and certificate, can be resistant to man-in-the-middle. And that's really how TLS authentication, mutual authentication in particular, are designed to do. And it's designed to defeat man-in-the-middle like this. And that's great, but PKI is very hard to deploy, hard to manage. So this is kind of a little bit annotated. In order to make everything work, people have to go into the advanced setting, they have to go into encryption, they have to see the certificate, and people don't necessarily understand the relationship between certificate, keys. It's not something that's very easy for example, my mother-in-law to understand. So it's something that's been very hard to use. So a lot of people turn to more easy to use, SMS-based or one-time token, kind of like the hard tokens that we saw, or even out-of-band authentication style, very easy to use dual authentication where you just click approve. But it has its vulnerability against man-in-the-middle. It's not very resistant to man-in-the-middle the way that TLS mutual authentications are, because it allows the real-time attack to harvest the token value at the time or the SMS code at the phishing site. And because it's valid for a very short period of time, usually it allows about 1 minute grace period, we can still use that as long as we're nimble enough. And there are tools out there that automate that process where the victim goes to the phishing site, logs in with their username and password, and then goes to the second factor authentication phase. It basically relays all that information in real time to the target website so that the attacker can get in using the relayed information. Probably already know all of this, but I've seen some misconceptions that are out there, and I just want to kind of clarify. There were some theories where, because this is a direct quote from I believe it was from an article, because one-time token or one-time password is stolen for only 1 minute, you should require the user to authenticate again for important functions and transactions. So you've probably seen this if you're like, for example, Amazon user, where if you're trying to go into your orders section, or if you're trying to actually place an order, or if you're at a bank, if you want to execute a transaction or a wire or a transfer, you have to authenticate again using your username and password. Just like that, rather than just relying on one-time token for just authentication, you should request it many, many times and as often as you would like for important functions so that it's defeated. Obviously, doesn't necessarily protect us from phishing. Phish users are there because they are incredibly gullible, or the attacker presented himself in a very convincing manner. So the phishing site really can act as more of a transparent proxy at that point to the server. So the user is interacting with the phish site, but all that data is relayed through the actual server. So that means that all traffic can be intercepted and modified, and some of the potentially harming traffic for the attacker can get dropped by the attacker if they wanted to. So the attacker controls everything in this manner. So the phishing site, basically, if it sees that, hey, maybe it's been 5 minutes since you logged in, maybe I asked you for a one-time password. Oh, you're trying to do something. Attacker is trying to, engage in a trade or something like that for the client and transfer money from his bank. The phishing site just simply asks, hey, for your security, please enter your token again. And a lot of times, the most gullible ones of us will enter it as many times as you want, or as the attacker would want. Another common misconception I see floating around is, especially this is the duo security. So answer to one-time token bypass is out-of-band two-factor authentication. And One-time password bypass that they're specifically referring to is that the user runs malware, the malware attaches itself to the browser or to the system to be able to kind of obtain that one-time token password from the browser session, because people have to read it and then enter it into the browser. So it hooks the browser user interface and keystrokes, the DOM to be able to keystroke, to monitor the keystroke and scrape the keystroke so that it can use it for its own advantage. But really, malware, you got a bigger problem, especially if the user is local admin. You can not only get just the one-time token password, it can be leveraged to get into the environment directly. At that point, really, you don't necessarily need two-factor authentication because you're already in using that the compromised node as a relay. And you can also get sensitive information from the memory, system, session cookies, and keylog, and really, ransomware. There's a lot of things that you can do where two-factor authentication really becomes an afterthought at that point. And of course, we see these type of feeds all the time. So out-of-band authentication is really interesting to us because we recently were able to exploit it quite often, is that a lot of people who use the two-factor authentication, the dual out-of-band authentication where you just have to click approve, is that it sounds really great at surface because the user, you don't have to actually read it, read the code and then enter it in. It's vulnerable to a particular point of time where it could be reused after the user uses it. You just approve it just once per use. Sounds all great, but there is a notion of confused deputy problem. It's similar to what cross-site request forgery is vulnerable to, but basically what this is saying is the user has no idea who's requesting it. So let's talk about this, right? So the user submits the username and password at the phishing site because the phishing email asks them to log in and validate that they can access a particular resource, like a new email feature or a new VPN or something like that. So once they get the username and password from the attacker, from the victim, and attacker authenticates the real site using the phishthread and push authentication. It chooses push. Now, user thinks that it's logging into an actual site, and at the same time, user phone gets a push notification authentication. Obviously, user approves it because it thinks that it's logging into a valid site in point number 1. But it's actually, the request actually came from the bullet number 2, or the step number 2, where attacker is authenticating. So user kind of blindly, or thinking that, hey, I initiated this, so approves it, but it's actually the attacker who gets in. And attacker can simply say, hey, something went wrong with our site, let's try again later, where at this point the attacker had already gotten in. Also, think about what happens after you authenticate, especially for a web application. When you authenticate with the username and password, you come up with what's called a session token, usually in a cookie, in a typical browser session. And after you authenticate that, you don't necessarily have to log in again. You just send in that token with each request. And if you have the right value in that token, in that cookie or the right cookie, it validates who you are, who've been authenticated. So even if you use a single-factor authentication or 3-factor authentication or 10-factor authentication, eventually what you end up with is that session token in that cookie. So that's interesting. What makes cookies more interesting is that cookies are often used as is. So it's kind of like a fixed value for that period of time that you authenticated. You just hand it over to the server. There isn't any type of exchange where you're not necessarily disclosing the value of the cookie. You basically disclose the value of the cookie in each of the requests. And a lot of times what we found is the sessions are really long. As long as you keep that mouse active, which you can do with a simple trick, you can actually keep the sessions very long. A lot of times you see something like 10 minutes or even 30-minute idle time. And we had SSL VPN, so a compromised account, lasting days on a single session after you authenticate. So there's a little bit of disconnect, as you see, is that one-time password rolls every 1 minute, but as long as you can use that, you have a couple of days, maybe 48 hours or 10 hours or something like that, as long as you keep that session active. And some sessions last really long. So if you use web application, if you use type of remember me type of things, it might never forget who you are. So as long as you get the right cookie and then you say remember me, you don't have to ever authenticate again. A lot of times, sessions last across IP changes. And this is oftentimes kind of where security and usability fight against each other, in that the typical mantra in the session management is that, of course, sessions should last across IP boundaries because a lot of people are mobile. A lot of people use their laptop, might close it, move into another conference room where they change IP addresses. They might jump in and out of VPNs. So we need to make it easier for them to do the job. But the security side of things, IP changes really should be considered more carefully because a lot of internal kind of enterprise applications that are not really open to the world or to the internet, such as your SSL VPN or your email, really shouldn't last across IP changes because what is possible is an attacker coming from another IP address, if they can grab hold of that session cookie, might be able to log in as you, and it might not raise any alarms, or it might allow you to do so while there is another session going on from another IP that's an actual user. So, and another thing to note is that authentication is done only during the session creation and while not maintaining that session. So sometimes what we see is that once you authenticate and then you disable that particular user account for whatever purposes. Maybe somebody realizes that, hey, the user account seems like it's compromised. I'm going to disable that user account on the back end. But because you have a session established with that application, that session lasts even though that user authentication credential is no longer valid. And we've seen that before where we get detected and we can't necessarily use that authentication. Again, we use a password, for example, but we're still logged into the SSL VPN because it doesn't routinely check whether, hey, the authenticated user, whether it's an invalid user or not. You already authenticated, and we have a session established. As long as the session doesn't expire, we're going to let you in. So what that means is that even if two-factor authentication is man-in-the-middle proof, once you got the cookie, once the attacker gets the hold of the cookie, then really the authentication access control you lose to the attacker. And what allows an attacker to get cookies? Oftentimes you'll see something like cross-site scripting. Cross-site scripting is a web vulnerability. It's one of the OS top 10 vulnerabilities where an attacker can leverage a vulnerable site that's vulnerable to cross-site scripting to steal your session tokens, oftentimes in cookies. And once an attacker grabs hold of the cookie from another IP, typically, will log in as you directly and hijack your authenticated session. Obviously, there are other ways, browser compromise and system compromise. We talked about how you got a bigger issue, but it can still be done where system compromise doesn't still let you in for some odd reason that you can't necessarily get into a particular application. Obviously, if you compromise a cookie, you might be able to get it. Some of the other SSL TLS weaknesses that's kind of been publicized in the last few years, such as the drown attack, Poodle attack, Beast attack, RC4, weak ciphers, and etc., could also be used to decrypt the encrypted session, where cookie values are about, anywhere, it's not very long, usually kind of a few bytes long, not few bytes, obviously it has to have a long enough, but it's not like a text document that you have to grab hold of. It's several bytes. So you can typically obtain that value from the decrypted stream, where some of these well-publicized attack methods are typically trying to prove that you can get the session cookies off of the encrypted stream. So what do we do about cookies? A lot of times, if you've ever run any type of vulnerability scans or web application vulnerability scans, you'll see that there are a couple of flags that might be missing on the session cookies, like secure flag and HTTP flag. Those flags should really be used to prevent some of the disclosure attack methods, such as disclosure of the cookies on an unencrypted session, or cross-site scripting session hijack could be prevented with something like HTTP-only flag. Also, if you're running any type of custom-developed web application, check for cross-site scripting issues. Perform web application assessments, run the scans, and identify those issues. And of course, if you know that you're using weak ciphers, address those weak ciphers by allowing only the strong ciphers. A lot of times I get questions of, well, will this impact the client compatibility? Yes, only if you are using a very, very, or if you're supporting like Windows XP and like an Internet Explorer 5 or 6. Obviously, something like Poodle, where you're disabling SSL version 3, that can be a little bit more tricky, but a lot of browsers are moving towards supporting only 1.2. So if you guys are allowing the users, or especially if it's an enterprise applications where you're controlling the user's endpoints, such as corporate desktops or corporate laptops are issued, you can control that people are using the latest Chrome, latest Internet Explorer, or latest Firefox. So you shouldn't have any issues for that. Also, this is kind of an interesting point that I mentioned earlier, is that for incident response purposes, you really have to prepare a way to identify and close connections that could potentially be compromised. This is related to where once a session is obtained, a session is valid until the session expires. And a lot of times there's a little bit of disconnect from the actual authentication credentials that were used to authenticate. So if you know that an attacker used an authentication credential to log in, and then you enabled it, then you have to go back and track down those Citrix connections, SSL VPN connections, or whatever connections that could be, or access to the intranet, access to whatever. Those connections really should be able to track down and be able to close it. So for the potential compromise situation, you should be able to have a way to identify all those connections and be able to close them. Some additional controls that that are typically not used on a intranet-based application, but something that you might be able to enforce on enterprise internal use only applications, is bind the cookies to IP or TLS session, so that the cookies can't be stolen by another user that is outside of that TLS connection, or from a different source IP address, and can't necessarily use that to hijack your session. So what's the point of talking about all this? Is that multi-factor authentication, like no other, is not a silver bullet. The lesson is that should you not implement multi-factor authentication, then of course you should. You should implement multi-factor authentication because it does solve partially some of the password problems that we talked about. Does multi-factor authentication provide additional security compared to not using it? Yes, of course. We actually recommend it to everybody, and if you guys don't have it, and if you guys do any type of security consulting with us, it will show up as a medium risk or high risk finding based on, depending on how much impact that it carries. But also understand where multi-factor authentication can fail. So just because you have multi-factor authentication doesn't necessarily mean that you can abandon controls related to phishing or man-in-the-middle attacks or some, web-based cookies. So use multi-factor authentication and educate the users. So phishing is still a real threat even if you're using multi-factor authentication. You can't be complacent in that just because you use multi-factor authentication, people can't get in. People do get in to environments like when we simulate an attacker, we get into an environment through phishing of a particular user or environment, kind of using the techniques that we described. And also, consistently identify and fix security issues in your environment. And that's always important, and you can't necessarily not abandon that train of thought because you use multi-factor. And monitor for suspicious activities and have incident response plans in place where if you notice an issue with a particular user account, particular source IP addresses, make sure that you have plan in place to monitor that and plan in place to remediate that particular incident, like we talked about. Also, this is kind of a side recommendation that I've seen some of our clients are using for the enterprise level kind of targeted phishing attacks for an organization. Something that you can do is that through your spam controls or through your email inbox rules, you can specify that a particular email is coming from an external source, and you can actually prepend some messages about the warning where even though we're spoofing, for example, b2bsecurity rather than btbsecurity.com, where we're pretending to be our IT help desk or IT support and asking users to log in, it will show up as clearly that this is from external source, and you can kind of see that it is coming from somewhat of an untrusted. Obviously, you can massage the pretended message to kind of show up whatever you want. And the rules, from what I've seen, at least from Exchange, in that a lot of the rules are flexible enough where you might be able to exclude somewhat of a, if you guys are using outsourced help desk or outsourced IT, you might be able to add some whitelist to that so that if people are using, if the emails are coming from those domains, you don't necessarily have to prepend some of these messages. But if people are using, domains that are not whitelisted, then they'll see the message and it'll help them remember to be more proactive about identifying and not responding to some of the phishing. So that kind of comes to the end of the conclusion, and it's about 11:45, and we have about 15 minutes for questions. I guess, Ron, I'll turn it over to you for the questions.
Yeah, thanks, John. If you do have any questions, there is a chat window that's currently open. A couple people had popped some just verifications that they could hear us in there. We'll use that as the method to take those questions so we don't have to answer or open up the actual audio bridge and get feedback or whatever it is. So if you do have any questions, just go ahead and type them in that chat window. Everyone will be able to see them, and then John can actually work through them and answer them. Otherwise, we'll wait a couple minutes, make sure everybody is able to get them in there. And if we don't have any, then we'll close up. So a couple minutes. If you do have questions, get them in that chat window, and we'll go from there. John, can you see the question that came in from Suleiman? about Office 365? Okay. If you want to read that and then answer it, that'd be good.
So the question is, how about Office 365 one-time passwords for encrypted emails? Is that process still vulnerable to man-in-the-middle attacks? Office 365 one-time password, could you clarify the question perhaps for encrypted emails? Is that specifically for encrypted emails, or are you talking about authenticating to Office 365 using one-time passwords? So I'll talk about Office 365 in general. So Office 365 can be configured with a lot of different authentication. A lot of times I've seen email authentication being done using ADFS, which could be utilized to support certificate-based authentication. So a lot of times, it's kind of simple. You don't necessarily have to think about actually authenticating, if you're using Office 365. If you're using AD member system, the authentication could be seamless. It's more of a single factor, single sign-on type of a feel from a computer perspective. Auth email that was sent encrypted. So authentication emails that was sent encrypted, such as HIPAA data. I'm not sure of the use case, and I guess we can have more of a side conversation about that to clarify some of that issue. Obviously, any type of encrypted email solutions that I've seen utilize typical username and password as well as one-time token. It's really no different from the kind of the common pitfalls that we've described. A lot of times those systems don't necessarily have the support for one-time token, but again, it's vulnerable to any type of man-in-the-middle attack if it's using one-time token. Right. So just to clarify, so if you sign into Microsoft account and then one-time passcode, some of the controls that could be placed in for Office 365, again, is that you have to log in from a corporate network. So an attacker from outside of that corporate network typically are not allowed to log in. I've seen that type of controls placed in Office 365 where you have a proxy and all the authentications have to go through the proxy, and all the kind of remote authentication that occurs, such as your phones and things like that, have to have support for certificate-based authentication. So there are controls that you can place to mitigate. If you don't have those controls, then it could be vulnerable to man-in-the-middle attack. Move on to the next question from Seth. Regarding phishing, is there a recommended spam filter that works pretty well and can detect phishing attempts? A lot of times what I've seen is, a lot of the spam filters work off of a similar technologies and metrics. Obviously, you should do all the best practices, such as policy sender framework, SPF, validation, as well as other validation, reputational controls for the MFA, the mail server, as well as the mail domain from which it's sent from, as well as the mail sender themselves, the content-based techniques that we've described. A lot of the spam filters actually have those capabilities. It's just a matter of configuring them. And kind of what we saw, the one time when we didn't successfully phish the users with our common technique, is that we've seen what I described, the pretending some of the warning signs actually helps users to identify somebody who is trying to spoof an internal help desk. So that has been a good control. Again, some of the techniques are evolving. So because of the social media, sometimes what we do is we use LinkedIn a user to, for example, arm an Excel sheet for salary compensation review, or here is a response to your job offer or something like that, and it has a macro. Obviously, that's not necessarily an authentication issue. It's more of a general phishing and how it's evolving from simple username and password catch to more of a system compromise level. But that's a separate issue. But from the spam filter, I would say, talk to the vendors and see, what kind of controls it can provide. We haven't necessarily seen one spam filter doing better. It's typically more of a configuration issue. Next question from Nick is that any suggestions on what to watch for from suspicious events perspective and logging perspective if trying to watch for phishing events and targeting your push tokens? Oh boy. What to watch for? That's really hard to do because it could be, people really could be coming from anywhere. One thing that we do to kind of get the low-hanging fruit out of the way is look for non-domestic logins, especially if you're a type of company that have a presence in certain countries or just the U.S. domestic side. You shouldn't necessarily see people coming in too often from the countries where people, where there are no offices and et cetera. Even if people are traveling, it could be some dedicated personnel that are doing a lot of marketing in certain areas, or they're just, they're traveling salesmen, so just one particular user kind of coming from a lot of different places. So one low-hanging fruit way of detecting it is to look for that exception. Look to see if anybody is coming from a different country to log in. Obviously, a lot of the advanced attackers will compromise an AWS node or something like that. So some of those logins are coming in from some of these cloud nodes. Again, there could be another indicator where any type of cloud-based services that's where it's easy to get a node or easy to get a system out there. You really shouldn't be generating an authentication request. So something like that could be a red flag as well. In terms of the actual behavior pattern of somebody logging in, there is not much you can do because from the server's perspective, everything looks exactly the same as an attacker coming, as an actual user accessing the VPN. It might be a different IP address. It might potentially use a different user agent strings, but not always. Again, it kind of depends on the level of the sophistication of the attacker. So, at BTB, for example, when we're monitoring for suspicious activities, we not only look for kind of foreign-based IP addresses, as well as kind of a unique user agent that you don't typically see that is used, such as not too many people use Opera, but apparently Opera has a lot of good features for hackers. So a lot of spammers actually use Opera and other browsers that are not typical. But again, it's a matter of just switching the user agent strings on the attacker side. It's a lot of times unsophisticated attacker might use that. Also, we see patterns from logging in from level 3, Amazon Web Services, Azure. When we notice something like that for user level activities, we might notice something. Sometimes we'll see something like behavior patterns of users are typically logging in from their home, Verizon, BIOS, for example, and then he jumps to a coffee shop every now and then logs in from here where he typically travels. So there's a pattern of kind of known location a particular user could be coming from, IP addresses or service providers. If he's coming from a service provider that's unknown to us and we haven't seen that before, we might alert the team to say that, hey, you guys should kind of look into that. So I would say that's probably kind of a combination factor that you use to do that. So yeah, if you have additional kind of considerations or thoughts or want to discuss it more, please let me know. Any other questions? I think I addressed most of the questions here.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, the questions were great. The responses were great. John, thank you for your time. I think this was a great webinar. If anybody has any additional questions, you can shoot them over if you have our contact information individually, and then also info@btbsecurity.com. We can get it to the right people. And otherwise, I think we'll go ahead and wrap up the webinar and everyone get to lunch that's on the East Coast. So thank you very much for attending. And again, thank you, John, for putting this together. Very informative.
Thanks, guys.